You don't have to vote, no.
Division.
Well, that is the division bell, which means that we're now live in the Politico Pub. I'm Dan Bloom, the UK political editor for Politico, and I'm joined by James Cartlidge, the Shadow Defence Secretary. Thank you very much. You have a pint of proper beer. I have a pint of non-alcoholic beer. And
I'm very tolerant and open-minded.
Excellent. Good. And you're my last interview of the conference.
Great.
So I can now go and collapse after this. It's
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Brilliant.
What's the best party you've been to at this conference?
I haven't really been to any parties, I would say. I wouldn't call them parties. We've been to drinks with some well-known newspapers.
All right.
Of course, there are many very good newspapers. But I didn't make it to the sort of, you get the 10 o'clock drinks. There's all these things at 10 o'clock, which are sort of meant to be more fun.
Yeah.
Pretty tired. I'm over 50 now, you see. So no, nothing particularly exciting on that front, but very busy more broadly.
I start to flag at about 10 as well, so I don't blame you.
I definitely flagged.
Yeah. Since we're in a pub, what's your favourite drink? What's your drink of choice?
Cider. Right. I am a cider drinker, as the Wurzels once sang. But particularly, actually, just to be clear, given all the stuff about Clarkson's Farm, so the pub in my village had closed. It is reopening. It previously had Suffolk cider, which is Aspel's, which is absolutely delicious. But it will now have on it Jeremy Clarkson cider, which is also very good, actually, to be fair. Can't remember what it's called, but there we go. Hawkston, that's it. It's very good, actually.
You should have invited him up to this conference.
Well, I've given him enough of a plug.
I'm going to get a tricky news question out the way first.
Okay.
Robert Jenrick was
Yes.
in the news today for saying Handsworth in Birmingham was like a slum, one of the worst integrated places he's been to. He said in 90 minutes he didn't see another white face. Would you have described it that way?
I mean, I haven't been there, I have to say, but from what I understand, he's given a very thorough explanation of those comments. Perhaps we didn't hear the whole context, etc., but he's given an explanation, and as he made them, that's fine for me.
I think Mel Stride was actually in here half an hour ago. He told my colleague, Anne McElvoy, that he wouldn't have chosen those words. Would you take the same stance?
Well, I haven't read the full, I've seen these situations before where something's taken out of context. I haven't read the full transcript, as it were, or watched it. Of course, we should all be careful in what we say, but I think he's given a full explanation, and that's important.
I want to ask a bit about your speech today. You've just come from giving it. You're quite friendly with the Veterans Minister, Al Khan, aren't you? Let's start with that. Like, what's it like having a friendship across party lines where, quite obviously from your speech, you don't agree with the government on kind of some key issues of policy around veterans and the Act?
Well, I think the veterans issue is one of the biggest dividing lines on defence. It is very serious. The reason we had a veteran on stage today was to highlight to the public the serious implications of what Labour are going to do. I have a lot of respect for Al Khan's. He is seriously decorated. He has a DSO. He served his country to a very senior level in the Royal Marines and Special Forces. And I'm obviously huge respect for that. And yes, we do, we get on as most of us actually do. Parliament is generally collegiate, as you know. And there is a strong consensus between both parties, the main parties, on Ukraine. But on this particular issue, I feel very strongly that the government is making a mistake. To me, it is extraordinary that when we face the military threat that we now, I'm afraid, do, that we should think somehow the priority should be to launch a whole load of legal witch hunts against former members of the British Army. I just think that's extraordinary.
Do you think the government's kind of listening to the criticism from you here at all, or do you think it's just, thinkers on?
So there is no question that there appeared to be a phase where you could see with Al Khan himself, who obviously served in Northern Ireland and, sees the point of view of the soldiers. It seemed that we were in a period where they were working out how to deal with it. And the way that they've chosen to deal with it is they've announced these so-called protections for soldiers if they are involved in these cases, which to me, I'm afraid are overblown. They are not particular protections. Harris, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, has said explicitly there are no different protections to veterans than from anyone else who might appear, with one exception, which is no cold calling. But that applies only from MOD contact. So obviously that only applies to soldiers. But essentially, if you really want to boil it down, we had a guy on stage who was out there in the early 70s They were shot at all the time, people trying to kill them. They were protecting us from terrorism. They were serving the country. They were obeying the orders they were given. And many decades later, to have them on trial, which is a political process when we're meant to have drawn a line under what happened in Northern Ireland, is to me extraordinary, and we will oppose it with vigour.
There was some suggestion actually back in the summer that Al Khan's was willing to resign as the Veterans Minister about that. Did he voice any misgivings to you?
I would never obviously talk about what I discussed privately with people. There was speculation that he was on resignation watch, and actually it should be the case that having served there, he had massive reservations. And the impression we got, he was therefore, he was the person in the MOD who had to be persuaded. And we found at last orals, when Mark Francois put some questions to him, he seems to have been persuaded that because the Irish are now involved in this new legacy process that Labour will put in place, that somehow that placates the matter, because supposedly that will mean that, for example, in addition to potentially cases involving the army coming back, there'll be cases involving provisional terrorism. But that is just so unlikely because there's no evidence. It's incredibly remote, the likelihood that there'll be new IRA cases. What there will be, without doubt, as soon as the Legacy Act is repealed, there'll be coronial inquests into, for example, Loughor. Loughor was a shooting back a long time ago, potentially 24 SAS soldiers involved in that. It happened such a long time ago. They were serving in the spur of the moment, trying to defend the country. And to me, we shouldn't be relitigating all that. We should be drawing a line under the Troubles and focusing on the threats we face today from Russia.
Just want to ask you about defence spending before we get to Russia. So I know you talked about this a bit in your speech.
Yes.
You were talking about part of defence spending moving on resilience and going on things like boating, boatface.
Correct.
And the rest of it. But aside from all that, we've got a target now, a NATO target, where it's 3.5% of national income on core defence and another 1.5 on resilience and all the rest by 2035. Would you want, if you were in power, to bring that forward sooner and get to that target sooner?
Well, I mean, first of all, Kemi has said she would ideally want the government to go to 3% in this parliament, right? But actually, it's not even as simple as you put it. So the division is between so-called resilience spending and core defence, right? So resilience spending is this 1.5%, which basically is already spent, and it includes, as you say, apparently it will include the Lower Thames crossing, which is interesting. First of all, because the Lower Thames crossing is not a military asset. Secondly, because it doesn't exist, by the way. It hasn't actually been built yet, which is interesting. So that will be the 1.5%. So it's essentially meaningless in terms of our military capability. The 3.5% core budget still contains a lot of spending that is not core military budget. And that's what we declare to NATO. Now, to confess, yes, when we were in government, when we spent 2% in the noughties, in the 2010s, it was something like 1.8% actual MOD budget and 0.2 things that have been added to it and declared as your NATO spend. But the thing is, under Labour, that element is getting much bigger. So in 27-28, when they make this thing, we're going to spend 2.6% defence, the MOD budget as a share of GDP is only 2.2. The 0.4 will be including things like the intelligence budget. That does not add military capability. And if you really want to boil it down, in 1985, that was the last year we actually spent 5% on defence, on the military. And we had 330,000 regular personnel. We had nuclear tactical weapons in every single domain, and we had 600 combat planes. When we spend 5% under their model, there'll be barely any change in the size of the armed forces.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is what are the hard differences in what you're promising compared to what the government's promising, and indeed are there, between now and 2035?
Well, I think it's very straightforward, because whatever figures are bandied around, the money's got to come from somewhere.
Well, it's a good thing you asked that, because we had Mel Stride on stage yesterday talking about 47 billion of cuts. Now, he's not talking about defence spending cuts, but are you going to ring fence defence away from those cuts? You're not going to, it's not going to be cut at all, or is that yet to be?
I'm not a shadow of chance, but I can definitely say it will not be cut. What I would say is, if the money's got to come from somewhere, we all know that welfare has got completely out of control. The pandemic did play a big part in that. But when a government has a majority of 174 and it can't cut welfare, you've got a real problem. And so, the sort of areas where we would make those cuts, Mel Stride has set out, we need to go as far as we possibly can because the level of the national debt is too high. And when I talk about the big picture for defence, I talk about the end of dependency. And I mean that in two ways. First of all, the end of the expansion of welfare at the expense of defence. That cannot go on. But above all, the end of the era of being dependent on the United States. Those two tectonic plates are coming together, and we will have to find the money for defence, and that will have to come from a more productive economy, but above all, discipline on the public finances. So I'm really pleased by what Milstride said.
I was going to say, because the Conservatives in government were trying to get at this and were struggling as well, right? To get to the kind of levels that we're talking about getting to. Well, is it remotely affordable, I guess, is what I'm asking. Like, can you say the money's got to be found from somewhere, but where on earth does one find that much money? If the government's plans are not realistic, how can you convince people that?
Well, I mean, actually, if you look, so in 2010, it is true that's the last time we spent 2.5% GDP, but that's the NATO declared figure, which just to be clear. But the country was bankrupt. We all know we were left a note informing us of that there was no money left. And we did have to take some very painful decisions in that period. But above all, and this is the fundamental point, the threat level was not what it is now. We then had, the focus in defence on what we call counterinsurgency, the sort of threat from organisations that would be serious, very serious in some cases, Al-Qaeda or whatever, but not the threat of other nations, peer military nations like Russia against us. That's what we had up to 1989. We now have that again, and that is a profound consequence for defence spending. In 2019, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Rishi was Chancellor. Defence spending, that was the biggest increase since the Cold War at that point. And actually, when we went to the general election, we had a plan to reduce the size of the civil service to get defence spending to 2.5%. But even then, we recognised, as the threat grows, you've got to go further. And yet, we do have to find the money. That's the hardest thing in politics. In many ways, the most important debate we've got to have as a country is where we find the money for all the things we want. Because 2019 was an exceptional election because it was about Brexit, get Brexit done. We had Jeremy Corbyn as leader, etc., the Labour Party. We then had a pandemic where extraordinary expenditure and that we weren't making efficiencies because money had to. And then the day that finished, Putin invaded Ukraine, we had the huge expenditure on electricity bills, if you remember, billions and billions to help people with their energy bills. So we've had a long period where we've put off those difficult choices. What Milstride said is that can't go on. We now need to be making those difficult choices.
Do you worry that this might, the position we're in on defence spending might actually push people to reform? Let me explain.
Yeah.
Sarah Atherton, she served in the army. She defected to reform last week. She was talking about the Conservatives failing Britain's armed forces. The size of the armed forces is reduced, 21% since 2012 by some figures. Isn't she right? The armed forces have been hollowed out over the last.
Well, if she was concerned about the reduction in 2012, presumably she wouldn't then have stood as a candidate in a general election some years later for us and been a defence minister for us. And my key point, Sarah, and I have massive respect for her, and I'm disappointed she's defected. But as I said in the hall today, the real test is when you're threatened. We're not talking about defence white papers and those years when we had peace and so on, when we really get threat. And that's what happened when Putin invaded Ukraine. The first time since 1945, a threat of war in Europe. What did Farage do on that day? He blamed NATO. They're our closest allies. They are the alliance we rely on for our defence, and he blamed them for the invasion. Putin blamed NATO in a recent speech at that convention he had in Shanghai. Whereas to me, what did we do on that day? And judge people what they do, not what they say. On that day, we were the only country at the time in Europe that stood by Ukraine, provided weapons to them immediately, in fact, even before the invasion, and helped them to survive the early attack. If they hadn't survived and Kyiv had fallen, we could have been looking at 1939, and I mean that. So what we did on that, if you want to criticise us, that was real, and it had an amazing impact, and other countries didn't do it. And Sarah Atherton was incredibly supportive of it at the time, and the person she now has her leader did not do it, and actually was sympathetic to our enemies. And that's a very serious point.
Well, I was going to ask you about the 1939 point. I mean, you had Eliza Manningham-Buller saying the other day that we're essentially already at war with Russia. Like, do you think that?
So I think the point, if they'd conquered Kyiv and Ukraine early, we'd have had them rampant and on the border of NATO. That would have been profoundly serious. I mean, I'd say like the late 1930s. As it is, they're now contained in Ukraine and using up huge amounts of materiel and personnel, not that Putin seems to care, has to be said. So the threat is now different to what it would have been then, but it's still very serious. And the threat, as you would expect now, is primarily what to us is grey zone. The actual chance of a direct military attack on the UK is still, thankfully, one hopes, relatively low. But the prospect of trigger points in Europe leading to grey zone activity that escalates is extremely serious, much more than it's been for a long time. And that's where we have to be vigilant.
And what about Donald Trump's role in this? So we had the big summit in the Oval Office, all the rest of it. Your former boss, Ben Wallace, who's perhaps a little bit more free to speak than you are.
A little bit.
He's accused, well, he's always more free to speak, but he's accused Donald Trump of dithering on Ukraine. And, you know, he's accused him of adopting Kremlin talking points and that sort of thing. Do you agree with him? Do you think that Donald Trump hasn't been supportive enough here?
I'm actually really encouraged by what's happened recently, because I think what's happened, you know, the president has his own unique way of dealing with these things. He wants to get peace. He stood on an election manifesto to the American people to bring peace, and that's what he wants to achieve. But it's not easy. And I think he's become frustrated with Putin, and I hope that means that the US, as the indications are, will be more robust. The sorts of area where we now need to have real action is on serious sanctions, particularly on some of the trade that is still going on with oil. It's feeding the Russian war machine. They're evading the sanctions that are out there. You know, we are going to continue supporting in indirect ways, economically and the provision of material. There is not going to be direct military support. But having said that, in terms of deterrence, we have the thing that I'm most frustrated about with our government is they don't seem to see the threat to the UK. And because of that, they're not acting with the urgency I would want them to. They say the right things, but the action isn't happening. Because if you want to avoid war, lesson of history is deter it in the first place by showing you're strong and ready to stand up to your adversary.
I want to ask you one thing about military policy in the US.
Yes.
The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he announced new military standards last week. He called them the highest male standards in training. He said all combat roles will be open to, you know, men and women, but if women can't make it excellent, if women can make it excellent, if not, it is what it is. Do you agree with that? What do you think of that approach?
Well, first of all, that's up to him. He's the US Defense Secretary. He speaks for them. I can't speak for his administration. I think actually, as a country, we've moved forward an awful lot in this area. An area supported strongly by Sarah Atherton, I should add, and it'd be interesting to see if the new party takes a similar view. You know, and for me, it speaks to wanting to expand the potential populace who could join the forces. I think one of the most common pieces of feedback I get on policy and how we could improve matters is on recruitment and medical questions, and the frustration people have who, for one minor reason, haven't been able to enlist. You know, how we deal with ADHD. Lots of people are going to have ADHD. They may make very, very good soldiers. And so I think what we've got to do is work out how we widen the lens of who we can recruit without undermining, for those in the regulars, the fact that you do have to pass stringent tests. So I think I'd be slightly more expansive in my approach. Ultimately, you still need those high standards. I mean, he's absolutely right on that. And the elite forces will have their higher grade and so on. But I think if you just look at the way warfare is going, drones are becoming really important. You're going to have a greater role for people further back who deal with data as much as direct kinetic confrontation. And I think that's a different type of recruit. It doesn't mean they shouldn't pass some physical checks, etc. But I think warfare is changing and recruitment does need to change with it. And we as a party want to look at that very seriously.
I'm almost out of time before I go to the room, but I just want to whip through a couple of other things.
Okay.
Is China an enemy of the UK?
China is definitely a potential adversary. That's how we should see them. We should be clear-eyed about the threat. I'm extremely concerned about the possibility of what's happened with this case that's been in the news.
Well, the reason I ask is because Downing Street was saying that it's because the Conservatives didn't designate China as a threat or an enemy that is why this case has collapsed. So shouldn't you said potential adversary, that's not the same as an enemy. Should the Conservatives have gone further?
Well, general statements of policy should never be the sole grounds affecting a decision made on a specific case. The allegation, and we don't know the full detail, is that there's been some kind of intervention, meaning the case cannot go forward. We don't know the full facts. One thing I do know is the Speaker is incredibly concerned about this, and I suspect when we get back to Parliament after conference, there will be a lot of questions to be answered on this matter.
We had Tony Abbott in here yesterday.
Oh, yes.
He was giving the Conservatives some advice on, turning back boats in the Channel, that sort of thing. He's suggested kind of turning boats around and sending them back into international waters.
To France.
To France, yeah. Would you want to bring in the Navy to do that? What's your approach?
It's interesting when I write an article or comment on social media, and other defence writers tell me they get the same. Nearly every post underneath is, why doesn't the Navy intervene in small boats? And the essential answer to that, the problem is, the only thing the Navy could do more than border force is have the threat of force, which must ultimately result in the use of lethal force, and that would be murder on the high seas. And people have to understand that. The law of the sea is, once they're into our waters, we have the duties that we do. I know that frustrates many people. Really, I think what you do with them at sea is ultimately a red herring. The French are not going to accept them back. We've got to deter them from coming in the first place. It's what happens when they get to the UK that matters. And it may not be a fashionable policy anymore, and we may have lost it in the courts, in the House of Lords, etc. But I still think Rwanda was the best scheme for this very simple reason, that it wasn't about third country agreements or what happens to asylum seekers eventually. It was very simple, that if you came on a small boat or you came illegally to the country, you would be processed in Rwanda. You were guaranteed to go there because that's where your case would be processed. And that in itself would have been a massive deterrent. And whatever people criticise it, smash the gangs, etc., no one's come out with a better idea as far as I'm aware. No one's explained how they would actually stop it, other than things that are clearly illegal and unlawful, like the use of the Navy in a military fashion. So yes, the Navy could assist border force in sort of, pure practicality, but all that would be is assisting those already at sea to come here once they're in our waters. What matters is what happens when they get here, and to me, there has to be a deterrent that stops them coming in the first place.
You ready for some quick fire?
Of course.
What's the naughtiest thing you've ever done? The Theresa May question.
Oh, my word. That I can say publicly.
Well, you're among friends. It's fine. Ignore the live stream. It's fine.
So when I was in my late teens, I was in several bands, and like a lot of people, I probably drank too much cider. I'm talking about cider. I still drink cider actually, and I did things then which, all I can say is, I'm not going to say any more on it other than thank God there was no social media at the time.
Drugs?
Nope.
No.
Well, alcohol's a drug.
You've got to give me a hint of what these things were.
I'm not really going to actually. I mean, look, we all got into trouble for things. I didn't go. Please, none of them are criminal.
Yeah.
I was in a band and we would drink too much and do silly things, but like everyone else did at the time. I don't think there's anything. I didn't run through a wheat field or whatever it was.
It was less naughty than the wheat field, basically.
I mean, that's extraordinarily
unnaughty.
Naughty, isn't it? Yeah, very naughty.
Your father-in-law is Gerald Howarth?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Sir Gerald Howarth.
Yes. What's the best piece of advice he ever gave you about politics?
So he was a defence minister. And when I became a defence minister myself, we went into my conservatory and he just sat there and sort of he went through all of the main procurements, as I was procurement minister, and all the things that were happening, and advised me on what we should do.
So actual proper policy advice.
Yeah, really good. I mean, he really knows his stuff on defence. Right? And so that's been a massive help. Very passionate on aviation in particular, knows his stuff. And yeah, and occasionally he, obviously we see them a lot. They've now moved to the constituency, my in-laws, and yeah, good relationship.
Final one, Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch?
What, for leader? What is the question?
Your favourite leader?
Both brilliant. I was Rishi Sunak's PPS when he was Chancellor through the pandemic, which is one hell of an experience. I was a minister in his government, and I've been Shadow Secretary of State under Kemi Badenoch. So you won't be surprised to hear, and a supporter of hers as leader, that I think both in their way were brilliant. And I think Kemi's got a massive future, and we all need to get behind her and ensure we have a strong future as a party.
Let's go to all brilliant questions. Does anyone have a question from the room? Come on, Pub. I know it's the afternoon.
You kind of skirted around Nigel Farage's response to the Ukraine invasion. In your view, is a vote for a reform government, does that put Britain's national security at risk?
I think you have to be very cautious in saying that electing someone literally brings a national security risk. That's quite a... However, I do feel very, very strongly that he is someone who has very ambiguous views on Russia. It's not clear where he stands. NATO is the backbone of our defense. The coalition that we are in is fundamental to our security. And as I say, he blamed them on the day of the invasion. He blamed NATO again in the general election, this so-called provocation. My word, the provocation is the oldest trick in the book. A dictator who wants to invade other countries and conquer them. Anyone can see that. The idea that someone who's supposedly going to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom cannot see who the good guy is between Putin and Zelensky is, to me, truly extraordinary. And just to be clear, I don't normally make individual criticism of politicians. I'm not one of these who criticises, personal stuff. It's only where I feel they have to be held to account. And on this, that is a really profound position that he took. If people really thought he was coming into government, this would start to matter. Because the question of where's he going to stand on NATO, that's how we defend our country. So this is not minor. Now, I suspect he will clarify these positions. I think he's tried to be a bit more forward-leaning. But I have to tell you, in the Commons, he never, ever attends defence questions, defence statements, urgent questions, defence debates. I think Richard Tice has attended one. Now, they have a small parliamentary party, but this is the biggest threat we face at the moment, and I do find it extraordinary. And there's an argument that if he becomes Prime Minister here, you have Le Pen's successor in France, etc., really serious questions over Europe's security. I think that is a very legitimate question. Explicitly saying they're a threat, I don't agree with. But the implication of where he stands is worrying, and to me, makes him not fit to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Does it worry you that the public don't seem to be listening to you on this? Look at the polls. Reform are way ahead.
But that is because the issues that matter most to people are those where they see Farage in a positive light. There's no point in denying that. You only have to knock on doors at the moment, even in a local council by-election where a local authority has no bearing on borders, that everyone raises immigration, particularly small boats. They see it as something that hasn't been solved, and they're right, and we can give our reasons for that, and I share their frustration, actually, having voted as many times as we did to try and do something about it. But, I do think people have doubts about him on this point. They want to see a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who stands strongly with our allies and represents strong national security. He doesn't do that, but that, for many of his voters, is not a concern. And I just have to say this, a small number of his supporters, particularly perhaps some of the earlier Reform members, from my experience, have slightly odd views on Putin, I would say. My experience, I've done interviews where I have strongly defended Ukraine and attacked what Putin is doing. And you get some very extraordinary harassment from certain people who've got this. And I mean, one of the most extraordinary things I found is the link between people who are anti-vaxxers and pro-Putin, for example. That sort of conspiracy theory, you'll meet almost no one who has that view. But in my experience, in Reform's really core support, those views are much more common than you would think.
You're getting them in on social media and
on social media.
Emails to your office.
We have had them in emails to the office. The most serious threat I've had on an individual level as an MP was from an anti-vaxxer.
You're sort of almost suggesting that a lot of Reform supporters are sort of conspiracy theorists here.
They are, and that's about their core supporters. The voters at large, 30% or whatever it is in the polls, clearly that is not the case with most of them. I think with most voters, they see him as someone who they like, who is charismatic, and who speaks to their frustration at the fact that we couldn't fix the things they wanted us to fix. Now, I can tell you why we couldn't fix them, and they're perfectly good answers. I can also tell you that if you're someone who, and I warned about Liz Truss's budget, I was very opposed to her stance. I thought it was reckless, and sure enough, blew up in our faces. But if your response as someone who wants to run Britain is to watch that and think the answer is to dial it up by about 100, then I don't think you've got what it takes to be a prime minister. But that's not where the people are. They don't care about things like that. He's not us, and they're still frustrated with us in the general election. He's not Labour, who people feel have failed in government. He offers something else, and at the moment that's incredibly popular. And things like his views on Putin, even his views on economic, fiscal prudence, etc., they're just not relevant to most people. They will be in a general election.
Well, on that chirpy note, I think we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to continue the defence theme at 5 o'clock when Penny Mordaunt is in for Pints and Politics with Anne McElvoy. So you can stay for that and ask her a question if you like.
I'm doing a seminar with BAE, which people are also welcome to, where we'll be talking about very detailed questions on defence, I think, probably.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock.
Thank you.